As discussed in the first part of this episode, propaganda depictions of enemy atrocities were intended to generate concern, anger, and outrage, which would then be translated into more active support, both ideological and material, for the war effort. We have seen numerous illustrations of enemy atrocities directed towards women. Similarly, wartime propaganda also contained many images of children and the elderly suffering at the hands of the enemy. Ill treatment of civilians included scenes of executions, torture, and even a few allusions to concentration camps. Like women, indeed perhaps more so, children and senior citizens are perceived as helpless and harmless, and are thus the most innocent targets of enemy aggression. Although home front propaganda encouraged everyone to participate in the war effort, young children and the elderly were not active combatants or even engaged in direct war production, so showing them suffering abuse and even death was one way of characterizing the enemy as innately evil. There are many fewer examples of this motif than women in peril or military in peril themed comic book covers, possibly because publishers didn't want to show children in danger, but more likely because the cheesecake component of women in peril and outrageous action art sold more comic books than images of elderly people or children suffering. Fighting Yank number 13, cover dated September 1944 but available on newsstands several months earlier, shows a group of children in peril. The Japanese guards are apparently engaged in some sort of perverse sport involving poisonous snakes and the captive children. This cover was drawn by Alex Schomburg, one of the greatest cover artists of wartime comic books. Schomburg also drew the cover of Exciting Comics number 39, dated June 1945. Nazis are spiking candy bars with poison and handing them out to ragged children in an occupied country. As with the previous cover, the Nazis seem to be doing this out of pure maliciousness, since they could have killed the helpless children in a simpler manner should they have chosen to do so. On the lighter side, but rather grim if you analyze it, this cover is from Comedy Comics number 17, dated July 1943. Super Rabbit saves some cute anthropomorphized animal children from a Japanese cat saboteur. For some reason, their school appears to be collapsing, even though the enemy agent still has the bomb under his arm. A significant number of wartime comic covers did portray various juvenile characters in extreme danger at the hands of the enemy, but these were either the youthful sidekicks of superheroes, such as Toro, the assistant to the Human Torch, seen here on the cover of Marvel Mystery number 51, about to get a swastika branded on his bare back by some Nazi Ku Klux Klansmen, or stars of comic book series in their own right, such as the Commando Cubs, the Young Allies, and so on. These images may contain some atrocity-related material, but the young people being threatened are not defenseless normal children, thus the atrocity impact of the imminent danger they are in is lessened. Elderly victims were also depicted on wartime comic book covers to illustrate just how ruthless the Axis was. Even before the United States entered the war, the Nazis were portrayed as brutal oppressors of the weak. Mystic Comics number 6, October 1941, depicts a bewildered senior citizen at the mercy of a whip-wielding Nazi. Fortunately, superhero the Destroyer appears to save the old man, tearing down the hated Nazi flag as he does. Captain America number 46 shows a white-bearded gentleman about to be fed into a furnace by the Nazis. In the background, we can see other civilians who've also been apparently red-tagged as Axis fuel sources. This Schomburg cover contains some unusual subtext. First, the Nazis seem to be eliminating non-productive prisoners by executing them in a furnace. Furthermore, these victims are all wearing color-coded tags. These seem to be eerie references to the yellow Star of David badges that German Jews were forced to wear, and to the Nazi extermination of Jews and other undesirables, in some cases in so-called ovens. This comic is dated April 1945, which means it was on sale several months prior to that date, and thus may be an early allusion to the Holocaust. The motif of execution of civilians and captured soldiers was a familiar one dating back to other conflicts prior to World War II, including the Spanish-American War, the First World War, the Sino-Japanese War, and the Spanish Civil War. On wartime comic book covers, the two most prevalent methods of Axis execution were firing squads and beheading by sword or axe, although hanging was also occasionally referenced. The intended victims were, of course, presumably unfairly condemned, and their impending deaths are seen as more evidence of the barbaric practices of the Nazi and Japanese enemy. In addition to children, women, and senior citizens, wartime propaganda also depicts men and women of the Allied armed forces as victims of Nazi and Japanese atrocities. The enemy is frequently depicted as breaking the rules of warfare, especially those regarding humane treatment of prisoners of war and the wounded. The mistreatment, torture, and even execution of Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen was a frequent topic in popular culture of the war years, and as usual was rooted both in actual events and in generalized propaganda motifs which had been used in prior conflicts. Most wartime propaganda dealing with this topic focused on the Japanese enemy with some real-life validity. One notorious incident was the Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were compelled by their Japanese captors to walk 60 miles with little or no food or water. Although it occurred early in 1942, details of the event, including stories of how prisoners were summarily executed by Japanese soldiers, were not officially released to the American public until 1944. The trial and execution of captured American flyers who participated in the 1942 Doolittle Raid on Tokyo was another event utilized in anti-Japanese propaganda, including the 1944 feature film The Purple Heart. Alex Schomburg's cover for Marvel Mystery No. 55, dated May 1944, alludes to the fate of the Doolittle Raid airmen. An American pilot can be seen on the gallows, and several other American captives are also visible. The air crews whose planes crash-landed in China after the raid were aided by Chinese villagers, some of whom later suffered reprisals from occupying Japanese troops. And the Chinese woman who is also standing on the gallows clearly symbolizes the suffering of our Chinese allies. These comic book covers show mostly Japanese atrocities because U.S. troops were not actively engaged in Europe until fall 1943, although they had landed in North Africa a year earlier. Consequently, there was little face-to-face combat with the Nazis prior to this point, so GIs weren't being taken prisoner and were at less risk of being on the receiving end of enemy abuse. Furthermore, the outrage at the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent actions allegedly taken in the Pacific against American soldiers predisposed Americans to believe in and accept depictions of Japanese atrocities. There were a large number of comic book covers showing Japanese soldiers mistreating, torturing, even threatening to execute captured, wounded, or otherwise helpless military personnel. However, the depiction of enemy atrocities against Allied military personnel was not entirely restricted to the Pacific theater of operations, as these comic book covers show. Another popular anti-Axis propaganda motif was the depiction of the Axis use of poison gas, germ warfare, or other weapons which had been banned by international treaty. Germany had used poison gas during the First World War, and Nazi scientists were experimenting with various chemical and biological agents. Mustard gas was employed by Italy in their African campaigns, and the Japanese had used poison gas against Chinese troops. Although chemical and biological weapons were not widely utilized during World War II, the fear of such weapons was still present, and propaganda made it clear that the Axis enemy was morally capable of creating and deploying such unfair weapons on military and civilian targets alike. The depiction of enemy atrocities in wartime propaganda was not merely a means of reviling the enemy and its dastardly method of warfare. It was deliberately calculated to instill a fear of defeat and its consequences, and thus generate a greater dedication to the total war concept, in which every citizen participated to the greatest degree possible in the war effort, since the alternative was plainly unthinkable.